Sarah Arnold. I'm the president of the Black Student Alliance here at Iowa State University. Today we'd like to thank our sponsors, the Office of the President, Miller Endowment Incorporated, established through the generosity of the late F. Wendell Miller, College of Education, Office of Vice President for Student Affairs, and the Committee on Lectures, funded by GSB. Also, we'd like to invite you to stay for a reception and book signing afterward. The Supreme Court's May 17, 1954 ruling on Brown versus the Board of Education ended racial segregation in public schools and laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement. The court unanimously ruled that an 1896 separate but equal clause was unconstitutional because it violated the 14th Amendment by separating students based on the color of their skin. As part of the Brown versus Board of Education 50th year anniversary celebration, tonight you will hear from Hal Chase and Alfredo Parrish discussing the history of white racism in Iowa education. Hal Chase is professor of African American Studies at Des Moines Area Community College and project coordinator for the book Outside In, African American History in Iowa, 1838 to 2000. And Alfredo Parrish is author of a chapter on Iowa attorneys in that book, and managing partner with the law firm of Parrish, Crudenier, Moss, Dunn, Bowles, Gribble, and Cook in Des Moines. ISU has opened our doors today to these phenomenal men, and now I ask that you open your minds as you join me in welcoming Alfredo Parrish and Hal Chase.
Well, thanks for the invitation. Looks like from the people who are here, I'm just really talking to the converted already. So I don't know what I can say to any of you that you don't know about Iowa education. I often tell people, really, I'm a product of Iowa to a great extent. Was born in Selma, Alabama. Went to school though. Finished college in Dubuque, Iowa, and the University of Iowa Law School. And I always make this disclosure when I talk about Iowa education. I have 4 children, and they're divided by almost 25 years. And I divide them into 2 sets. One of my sets of kids went through the public education system in Iowa, and they both went to Iowa Law School. I was just telling, Sarah, who just introduced me? Where are you? Oh, I'm trying to recruit her already for Iowa because I'm on the board of the Law School Foundation board there, and I'm said it's one of the best schools for law anywhere in the United States. And my daughter went there, who now practices in Nashville, and my son, who practices with me, went to Iowa Law School. So I make that disclosure before I start my criticism of Iowa's education system and its shortcomings. So I was watching this interview last night, I think with Greta Susskind, the interviewer for, I think, the Fox News. Before that, she was a Georgetown professor, I guess, and she was on CNN before that, and she made this disclosure. She was talking about the candidates and said, they're requiring me to disclose that my husband gave money to John Kerry, and now I'm going to interview him. So I've made my disclosures now, and so I can talk about the Iowa education system. I'm a strong believer in the public education system in Iowa. Unfortunately now, my 2 younger set, because of my fears at this point, and we went over and looked at a public education school system. I have a almost 7-year-old who's about to go to, she's at Montessori school now, but I'm trying to talk her into going to Greenwood, which is a public education system. My youngest kid, who is 3, will be 4 soon, is now going to Montessori as a private school. But let me tell you my concerns. My concerns really is the diversity that they must have. I believe that is a key part of their education. Without diversity, if my kid's going to Montessori school, which is basically a all-white institution, it's a little frightening for me that as she goes through the system, that she will not get the diversity that she really needs in order to survive in this society. But what troubles me about that in Iowa, and those of you who went to your precinct caucuses the other night might have seen circulating around a petition about what's happening to education in Iowa. You know, we used to pride ourselves, obviously, in the great test scores that we would battle out with Minnesota and a couple of other states. And now we see, to some extent, they're dropping. And we also see, which is somewhat frightening, the buildup, particularly in some schools around the state, not just with black kids, but now with Hispanic kids, the fear that whites are leaving. And what is happening when they are leaving the central city areas and moving out to areas like Clive. I was looking at a couple of articles and preparing for this, even in some of the other towns around the state, they're creating this tax base where really we are having the same issues created in Iowa that we have in some of the other major cities and states. That means that the cities with the highest, the schools with the highest concentration of minorities are having the lower tax bases. So that brings me back to the issue of my concern about my children not going to the schools that my first set of kids went to in terms of quality, but even as they choose diversity over premier schools, the choices that I am concerned about now is whether or not the public education system is going to live up to its true creed of creating the best educational system that Iowa is noted for. And that's a great fear of mine right now. Those of you who have had the opportunity to follow the news stories in these schools around Iowa, particularly in Des Moines, sometimes in Waterloo, Davenport to some extent, you'll note that the expulsion rates for kids in the inner city schools for black kids is much higher, and for Hispanic kids is much higher than it is for the white kids. So that's a fear of mine as I choose diversity over what I term might be better schools that are now dominated clearly by the white students and the greater tax base. The other problem as we try to find diversity in Iowa, particularly in the educational institutions, is the fact that we find that the so-called talented and gifted programs that we create in these schools where we try to target the kids who are going to come out and go to college, go to highly skilled schools, you find that these talented and gifted classes are not going out and looking for minorities. And consequently, what is happening in the educational system, these talented and gifted programs are really gearing themselves for white kids. And you're not going to find very many talented and gifted kids for minority kids. In the discussion I had last week with the principal of Greenwood, not saying that based upon my genes either my kids will qualify, but hopefully on my wife's genes they might qualify for a talented and gifted program. I said, what are the possibilities of this kid getting into a talented and gifted program? She says, well, you know, we'll make sure we keep an eye on him and exclude your genes, but what we really want to focus on is whether or not this kid is going to get into any program. But we do have what they're creating now in the Des Moines district, sort of a supplemental talented and gifted program where they're trying to target minorities. But do you realize that less than 30% of minority kids in the schools are on the college track program? That is frightening. That's in the state of Iowa. We're not talking about going to Chicago, going to New York, going to Los Angeles. We're talking about right here in Iowa where less than 30% are in a college track program. And then the college track program doesn't even take into consideration what is called the talented and gifted program. So that's something that we have to look at. So that means that when you're tracking minority kids in this state, with less than 30% going into the college program, it creates a situation that is just disgraceful for this state. And those of you who are educators and those of you who have some influence in the educational system within this state ought to take a good, close look at what is happening in our educational system amongst the minorities and within our schools. Part of it is we all know we're facing a budget crunch. When this budget crunch comes down, it's going to always impact minorities. But traditionally, it's always impact minorities greater anyway when you have a situation like that. So what I'm concerned about now as we talk about diversity is I make the decision with what I call my second set of kids. You know, am I going to make the choice to put them in a public school knowing the issues that are going to be created there? Or I'm going to make an economic choice that I have that right to make and I have that ability to make, and talking about putting my kids into a private institution and lose diversity. At the moment, we hope we're trying to create diversity with these kids, but eventually we are going to have to make some tough choices, because I don't think, in my opinion, and as I made my disclosures early on, that the school systems that my first set of kids knew is the same school system in Iowa. And I have some grave concerns. And I think a lot of it is based upon the fact that we are not really addressing some of the critical minority issues, such as expulsion, such as the inequities in the tax base, such as in some schools having benefactors, and some of the inner city minority schools not having the benefactors, because in this state you don't have the resources within the minority community so they will become benefactors for the inner city schools. So consequently, we look for other people to do it, and they do it in things like, you know, perhaps sending the Valley Band out to march in the Rose Bowl, or you will have some other situation where we'll send a group out to Chicago to the Field Museum. And we don't have that in the inner city, and consequently we have some very serious problems that will eventually develop in Iowa. And let me tell you where that leads us to in terms of a vision for this state. Both my parents were teachers in Alabama, so I'm a great believer in the education system. They were products of the Alabama education system. I represent a lot of teachers across the state of Iowa. I always tell them that that's an interest of mine. It's something I've always been interested in doing. I have a lot of clients who come in and out of my office all the time, teachers and principals who are employed in this state, and they share with me some of the problems that they feel, not just black teachers, but white teachers, Hispanics, and others, teachers' aides who I've represented. And they share with me some of the problems, but I have a great fear that we are really not recognizing how serious some of the problems are within our educational system. And let me tell you what that leads to. And perhaps, I don't know how much of this will go in the newspaper, but when I speak, I normally have to be fairly frank about my thoughts, and I don't mean to hurt anyone's feelings, but let me tell you where that leads to. And I've been thinking about this for some time, and I was telling my wife this morning I think I was going to share some of these thoughts. And I'd written a rough draft of an article on it. You know, I look at some of my friends at the Attorney Generals of the state of Iowa. They have about 118 lawyers. I think they might have one minority lawyer employed there, or two. I look at the Polk County Attorney's Office, where they prosecute the majority of minorities in the state. At best, they might have 2 out of about 35, 40 lawyers. I look at the majority of the white law firms in the state, and I probably shouldn't call their names because they'll be upset with me since I litigate cases against them all the time. But there is not one major law firm in the state that has a minority lawyer, a black lawyer employed. At one time, the Iowa State Bar Association recruited a group to go into 2 of the firms, the Shuttleworth firms and the Nine Master firm in the state, and they went in, and both of them eventually left. But at this point, none, zero, zilch. What does that tell you about our educational system? What does that tell you about the people in the state who say they have a commitment to minority rights? What do you say about the people who have to enforce not only with the Board of Regents and their policies, but also the school boards and their policies, when you have a firm that represents the school board that has no black lawyers, women, black male lawyers to understand these problems? That's the result that we have in Iowa. And I could go on and list organization after organization after organization in this state where that occurs. And I'm sure if this is in the paper tomorrow, people will say, geez, why did he say that? But it's the truth. You know, some things we can't run from, and that's the truth. What did Harry Truman say about the truth? He says, I'm giving them hell or something like that. And he says, I'm not giving them hell. I just tell them the truth and they think it's hell. But, you know, it's really sort of like that in this state. But let me tell you, I'm a very optimistic person. I wouldn't be in this state, and I was telling one of the reporters when I was talking with him earlier, I'm a very fortunate person because I've had the opportunity to get a good education in the state. 2 of my kids have gotten a good education in the state. I plan to stay in the state, staked my claim here. But I do think that the responsibility to improve some of the issues should not just fall to the white community. I think oftentimes we as blacks and other minorities don't take a stand or do the work that is necessary to improve our status. One of the most, let me explain why I'm an optimist. I called, and I won't list the person I'm supporting for president, but I called one of his supporters and I said, in the debate, you should mention the fact that in Iowa, we had a school board member, Kale Dalobi, who I've known for years, who's a Muslim who's elected to go on the Des Moines school board. And where else in a time when we were engaged in a war in a Muslim country would you get a Muslim elected to a school board in the majority white community? Well, that's why I'm an optimist. This is a great state for minorities. I don't care what anyone says. It's a state where if you buckle down and you work hard, you can accomplish almost any goal you want to accomplish. But clearly we have problems in our educational system and in our employment areas that we need to improve. But that improvement needs to come from both sides. And in closing, I'm going to talk about our institution. You should never talk badly about the place where you're speaking, should you? I'm sorry, but anyway, I know at Iowa State in both Iowa, and I truly love Iowa, and I could be attached to Iowa State too if I had gone here. But clearly you have problems where you're trying to recruit minority faculty and the issues that tie into that, whether or not if you go out and recruit a minority, are you bending over backwards and creating an environment that's better for that minority than you would for an ordinary, say, person who's white or some other race? I think sometimes you have to make those sacrifices. Because when I look back, when I started law school, there were 3 of us in the University of Iowa class. And that diversity, that experience, and the friendships and the interactions and the relationships I built from that, and I believe those other students built from that, made us better lawyers. So I think you do have to bend over backwards and create situations that might be more favorable. I think in order to create diversity, you must do that. That's the sacrifices that diversity requires. So I think we have to do things like that. And those battles that develop from that, and those interchanges that develop from that, they're good for an educational institution, to have those exchanges, to have those debates. To me, that's what an educational institution is all about. But each time, I always come down on the side of diversity. I think in this state we need to do a better job in our elementary school system, in our high school system, and more importantly, in the major 2 institutions that everyone follows, that's Iowa and Iowa State, but also in our public institutions where we now have these majority, you will never have minority in the majority, but so many whites and so few blacks that I don't think the people who lead these positions are really doing their jobs. When Al Sharpton asked Governor Dean that question, and Governor Dean said, well, I don't have anybody in my cabinet position who's black, and then someone came back later when they had time to think about it and say, well, it's 96%. Everybody said, well, Iowa's 96% too. But don't you think there are people, the governor's general counsel, Brian Gentry, is black in Iowa. There are other people who can occupy positions, but we have a duty in this society, if we are white, to go out and recruit these folks and create that diversity that is so lacking sometimes in our state. So each time I come down on the side of diversity, but I am optimistic about this state and our ability to make this even a greater state than what it is in our educational system. Thank you.
My name is Hal Chase, and I was born, in terms of disclosure, I was born in Des Moines, lived there for about 7 years, and like Al Parrish, I'm a product of a segregated educational system. His in Alabama, mine in Kentucky. So what I learned at about age 8 was that there was something called the Civil War, and that in Kentucky, if you were from Iowa and you didn't have an accent, you were either a Yankee, a damn Yankee, or pardon the phrase, nigger lover. So in their heads, I got thrown in with African Americans. And around the corner, there was a retired white couple, Mr. and Mrs. Iron, and they had a housekeeper, a cook, a laundress, Miss Ora Case, who was also, during the day, during the school year, the teacher of the 3rd grade at segregated Mayo Underwood School. She had a tradition of bringing young African American men into her home, and so that happened. The time I got there, there was a young man named John Allen Sykes, and John Allen Sykes and Hal Chase became boyhood buddies. So that's what I thought about when I heard Al talk about diversity. We didn't even know the word, we just enjoyed each other's company. So when people ask me, how did I get into this? Why, everything in life, I think, is coincidence. I think you'll grant me. But the question is, why do you stay in it? And as Al implied, the reason I've stayed in it is because African American history, as I mentioned to Kirk, is a history of an inseparable, dialectical, and seminal relationship in our culture. So that, I like to think, led to my involvement in this. This is outside in, this is why Hal Chase is in front of you. That is, excuse me, 12 by 9 by 2 by 7 pounds. It is a collaborative, and we have with us tonight Willis Gowdy, Iowa State University sociology chair and specialist in demography, wrote our chapter on demography. I appreciate Willis coming out tonight. But we had 36 authors, 39 people total, who for no pay or royalties spent 6 years putting together this book, and there's nothing else like it in this country. Because it is, as I mentioned to Kirk also, to me it's the most beautiful example of public history. Now public history, somebody's nodding, I think they know the concept. Public history for me is illustrated in the cover. And here's my metaphor. Imagine a jigsaw puzzle as big as the sky. Then think about the pieces that are like stars. Public history says all those different pieces, everybody's a star. The trick is connecting them all and seeing the big picture. That's what outside is. Outside in is, and let me open it up, because, wouldn't you know it? Just a few there, just a second. Getting a little bit better. Ooh, I get lucky now. Each chapter, let's get demography here. This one we can all relate to. Our liberties we prize, our rights we shall maintain. Every chapter begins with a big photo. There are more than 1,000 photos in here. And as Dr. Meredith Saunders can attest, people like him let us come to their house, take photographs of their photographs, and that's what fills Outside In. It's our history. It's us. Black, white, blue, or green, here in Iowa. So that's what this is really about. Kirk asked me, that's my essential message. Everybody here counts. Everybody here makes a big difference. Everybody here is not only connected to everybody else, but as a genealogical friend of mine says, Hal, everybody's related. We're all related. It may be by marriage, but we're related. So what you're going to see here is like a film. And it's about 17 minutes long, if that equipment will work, start to finish. And I'm as serious as I can be. Please pray for it. It has a mind of its own. And that mind interrupted on Monday down in Iowa City. But then it came back. So you're going to see on that screen, the lights will go out, and then you'll hear recorded narrative. And so before that, those of you on my right maybe move closer, because it's all going to be over there, as you can see the projection. And then you'll hear the recorded narrative. You'll start to see those images dissolve in and out on a screen. Several of those images relate to a case, Clark versus City of Muscatine. And after that, I've got some concrete information that interesting parallels between Brown versus State Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, in 1954, and Clark versus City of Muscatine, 1868. So we'll get back to those parallels and bring it home to us again. So ladies and gentlemen, if you'll please say a prayer for this equipment. It's all set up and it should go. Take them all the way down. I appreciate that.
In the beginning, our earth was without form, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said, "Let there be light." On the second day, God created the oceans, including the Atlantic, connecting Africa, Europe, and the Americas. On the sixth day, God created man and woman in many colors, as you see. In 1776, our forefathers and mothers created a new nation, dedicated to the proposition that all men and women are created equal. The transatlantic slave trade contradicted this ideal, and some 10 million West African people like this man were crammed into ships like this one and sold into slavery in the Americas. One of their descendants was York, a key member of the Lewis and Clark expedition which explored the Louisiana Purchase. Hence, Iowa became a territory in 1838 and a free territory the following year, when Chief Justice Charles Mason outlawed slavery with his ruling in the case of Ralph. Iowa's free soil also attracted free blacks, like those who bought these farms in Fayette County in 1852. But living on Iowa's free soil, as Dred Scott did in Davenport, did not make him free, as he learned in 1857. Yet many enslaved men, like John and Governor, whose Missouri owner offered this reward in Burlington, escaped slavery on Iowa's extensive statewide underground railroad network, which John Brown used repeatedly. In 1859, he recruited 4 Iowans, including Edwin Coppock of Springdale, for his famous raid on Harper's Ferry. And the war came, as Lincoln said, in which black Iowans, like this man, served under flags like this one of Iowa's 60th Regiment of U.S. Colored Troops. Iowa suffered the highest per capita death ratio of any state in the Union, giving a new birth of freedom to a government that included these congressmen and senators. Iowa became the bright radical star of this new freedom by guaranteeing black men's right to vote in 1868, the same year that Alexander Clark Sr. of Muscatine sued, and Chief Justice Chester Cole ruled that Muscatine must admit his daughter Susan to its schools. Iowa's bright star dimmed the following year by a white mob which murdered 5 blacks on the steamboat Dubuque. But it burned brighter when it attracted Civil War veterans like Medal of Honor winner James Gardner to Ottumwa, and businessmen like Jasper Prince DuQuoin, where he owned this general store. It attracted aspiring students like George Washington Carver to Winterset, Simpson, and Iowa State. It also attracted athletes like Bud Fowler to pitch for Keokuk in 1885, 2 years before Cap Anson of Marshalltown, behind the Black Boynton Center, led the movement that excluded blacks from the big leagues. Iowa's bright star also attracted black women, like school teacher Mrs. Minnie London, to Buxton, a coal mining company town located in southeast Iowa. From 1900 to 1922, it was home to some 5,000 plus people who built churches like Mount Zion Baptist that you see, and organized cultural institutions like this band. Its black majority, mostly miners, attracted black doctors like Edward A. Carter from the University of Iowa, and lawyers like George H. Woodson from Howard University, one of the original 29 members of the Niagara Movement, founded by Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, whose first wife, Nina Gomer, was from Cedar Rapids. Buxton also attracted black businessmen like George Neal, and supported an integrated baseball team, the famous Buxton Wonders, as well as integrated marriages like that of the Andersons and that of the Doyles. Black Iowans also advanced in Webster City, where Clara and Charles Conley operated a successful catering business. In Red Oak, where Pearl Everhart owned this organ and piano store. In Missouri Valley, where William Matthews owned the Sunnyside Dairy. In Gravity, where Richard Dick Johnson owned and operated this barbershop. And in Sioux City, where Oscar Micheaux, the father of black film, published 2 of his books. The Iowa Bystander headlined such achievements every week from Des Moines. In 1903, it declared the Algona Brownies the best in the West. In 1904, it recognized George E. Taylor of Oskaloosa as the first black ever nominated for president by a national party. In 1912, it heralded Ada Hyde and Leda Carey as the first black female graduates from the University of Iowa. in 1915, it applauded Des Moines attorney S. Joe Brown of Keosauqua, his wife Sue M. Brown of Oskaloosa, and Harvey Ingham, editor of the Des Moines Tribune, for founding the Des Moines NAACP. During World War I, it praised these Mississippi people for joining the Great Migration and moving to Waterloo on the Illinois Central. It also praised these Iowans for earning commissions at the World War I Fort Des Moines Black Officer Training Camp. After the war, it applauded James B. Morris Sr., Charles P. Howard Sr., and Gertrude Rush and others for founding the National Bar Association in Des Moines because the American Bar Association excluded them. In the 1920s, it cheered the aerial feats of ISU student Edward Banning, as well as the All-American play of Iowa's Frederick Duke Slater, and the victories of Dubuque's 1920 Olympian Saul Butler. In 1923, it mourned the tragic death of Jack Trice, who died of injuries playing for Iowa State. At the same time, it protested the rise of the Klan in Iowa, documented by this Klan clave in Davenport, and this parade through downtown Des Moines, led by Police Commissioner John W. Jennings. It also protested the University of Iowa's exclusion of black students from its dormitories, which led the Iowa Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, establishing this house at 942 Iowa Avenue for black women. The faith of congregations, like those of Second Baptist in Mount Pleasant, overcame such white racism. So did educational achievement, like Frederick Patterson's master's degree from ISU, before becoming the president of Tuskegee University and the founder of the United Negro College Fund. Solidarity was another factor, as you see from these photos of the United Mine Workers taken in Des Moines, of the Masons taken at their state convention in Sioux City, of the Knoxville Men's Gun Club, and especially that of Cornette Allen's family in Ottumwa. Black Iowans also overcame the Great Depression in the 1930s by switching their political allegiance to the Democratic Party because of such New Deal programs as the National Youth Administration, which hired these Sioux City women, and by joining labor unions like the CIO, seen here in their Cedar Rapids convention. They overcame it spiritually by cheering the 1932 gold medal of Hawkeye track star Edward Gordon, and materially by hunting rabbits like Edward and Paige Comer of Manly, or fishing like Arthur Props of Des Moines. Bill Bibb of Ottumwa High overcame it by earning the highest score on the IQ test. This couple did it by dancing at the Billiken nightclub in Des Moines, and Ottumwa's Royal Entertainers Club overcame it with this picnic. African Americans, like white Americans, even overcame it by becoming hobos, like Callowell, the Brit Hobo King of 1939. During World War II, black Iowans fought white racism at home, as well as Nazi white racism abroad. Striking blows in this double V campaign were Ottumwan's Robert Williams, one of the famous Tuskegee Airmen, and Bill Downey, one of the first black Marines. Sioux City's Frankie Williams, who served in the Navy, and Clarinda's Vernon Baker, who earned a long overdue Medal of Honor in 1997. In addition, 7,000 black women struck blows by completing their WAC training at Fort Des Moines. Thousands of other blacks struck them by coming to Iowa for jobs, like this one at John Deere in Waterloo. Lulu M. Johnson of Gravity struck hers by being the first black female to earn a PhD in history, not only in Iowa, but the nation. Blows for equality were also struck after World War II by Mrs. Georgie Morse of Des Moines, who led the state conference of the NAACP, by Meredith Saunders of Mason City, who earned his Eagle Scout badge in 1945, by these co-eds who integrated Currier Hall at the University of Iowa in 1946, and by the Catholic Diocese of Iowa, which ordained Father Allen Simpson of Ottumwa as its first black priest in 1947. Edna Griffin and others struck their blows by picketing Katz's drugstore in Des Moines for refusing them an ice cream cone in 1948, the same year that former Vice President and Iowan Henry A. Wallace denounced segregation in his presidential campaign. In early 1949, Fred Martin and his supporters struck their blow by electing him student body president of Ames High. In the 1950s, Johnny Bright attacked white racism with his All-American play at Drake, while Don Graves did it as Iowa's first black high school coach. Des Moines native Dr. Philip Hubbard did it by being University of Iowa's first black professor, and Waterloo's William Parker did it as Iowa's first black judge. George Johnson of Marshalltown fought it with his service in Korea. Vernon Wilkinson protested with this sign when Khrushchev visited the Garst farm. And Des Moines piano legend Spec Red undermined it every time and everywhere he played. In the 1960s, Marcia Moore of Fort Dodge took her assault on white racism to Mississippi and registered black voters during Freedom Summit. Tom Offenberger of Shenandoah took his protest all over the United States as Dr. King's press secretary. And Vincent Lewis of Des Moines waged his own war against it in Vietnam. On the home front, Viola Winston was elected president of the Wapello County 4-H. Archie Green was elected Ames High student body president. Mrs. Willie Glanton of Des Moines was the first black elected to the Iowa legislature. And the Reverend James Thomas was the first black elected to be Iowa's Methodist bishop. At UNI, President and Mrs. Bill Mock led a march to support the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In the 1970s, Miss Iowa, Cheryl Brown, broke the color barrier at the Miss America pageant, and Des Moines art teacher James Harris broke it as the first black president of the National Education Association. Jimmy and Lou Porter broke it by founding the state's first black-owned radio station in Waterloo. And Penny and Lee Ferguson broke it by establishing the Gateway Dance Theater in Des Moines. In the 1980s, Thomas Mann Jr. of Des Moines became Iowa's first and only black state senator. George Boykin of Sioux City, the state's first black county supervisor. And Dr. Percy Harris of Cedar Rapids, the first African American on the Board of Regents. In the private sector, ISU PhD Michael Martin became the first black director of research for Gar-Seed. In the 1990s, U.S. Attorney Don Nickerson, since elevated to the bench, became one of Iowa's leading law enforcement officers. Teamster trustee Ron McLean of Des Moines, seen here beside Teamster President Jimmy Hoffa Jr., one of its leading unionists. And Ruth Ann Gaines of Des Moines East High, one of its leading teachers. In politics, Clinton's Lynetta Wynn became Iowa's first black female mayor. Preston Daniels became Des Moines' first black mayor. Art Johnson became the state's first black sheriff. And Almo Hawkins of Des Moines became the first black nominated for lieutenant governor. But it was Dr. Paula Mahomes and Dr. Karen Drakes miraculous delivery of the McCoy septuplets in 1997 that put the African American history of Iowa on the nation's front pages. Yet racism remains, as you see, and most still see themselves as either black or as white. We'd rather not think about this, but instead applaud the thunderous performances of Centerville native Simon Estes. Moving beyond racism means seeing each other as beautiful, like this bride and bridegroom, as classmates, like these in Waterloo,